So we're joined by Antonio Vargas and Ryan Haecker, and we're going to talk about the history of Platonism, Christianity, and the reception of philosophy between various traditions. Welcome, Ryan and Antonio. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here. My name is Ryan Haecker. I've just finished and submitted my PhD at the University of Cambridge. I studied under Rowan Williams. I wrote my dissertation on origin of Alexandria and the transformation of ancient logic in Christian Trinitarian theology. I was the principal convener of the New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference, and I'm also working on editing a book on New Trinitarian Ontologies at the moment while I prepare for my Viva. And you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Haecker.
Thanks. Right, my name is Antonio Vargas. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Brasilia, but I did my PhD at the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, and my PhD research has just come out in book form as Time's Causal Power, Proclus and the Natural Theology of Time by Brill in their Philosophia Antiqua. And I can be found on Twitter as at Philo Antonio, Philo with PH. And and I have a blog with two friends where we talk about issues relating to Platonism and Christianity and Christian Platonism, which is called mosisatticizing.com.
For me, one of the things that interests me a lot about late antique philosophy is that there's a kind of exchange across cultures, languages, traditions, religious perspectives, etc. And, in our own time, we think, at least according to the official sort of liberal ideology, that, we're so open and progressive and there's this free flow of ideas, when it really strikes me that there's only one idea, as the French say, the pensée unique. And we have various cultures and peoples speaking, but they're all speaking in a kind of American mode. I feel like there's not really a lot of actual difference in the world, especially not in the world of ideas. There's a lack of real difference. And beyond that, I think that, when we talk about ongoing public debates, whether it's politics, philosophy, whatever, there's really a kind of tragic inability to understand one another. If you look at the Jordan Peterson, Slavoj Žižek debate, it's obvious that Peterson hadn't read or prepared for anything, but it doesn't stop people from remarking or commenting or attacking various perspectives, positions, worldviews, or whatever, the fact that they're utterly ignorant. And when I look at the late antique period, I get this impression that people actually had some kind of real dialogue, even across chasms that we would consider to be today quite great. So I guess for both of you as scholars, what do you make of this contrast between the late antique and the contemporary before we begin?
Well, I believe that there's a number of reasons for the ideological uniformity that you describe. One is that we all participate in a common culture. That is, we all are listening to the same stories, reading the same newspapers, watching the same films. And so regardless of whether you travel in the Western world, you typically will find people who have a similar cultural background. Another issue is I tend to think that people have forgotten the possibility of disagreement. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes we assume that we know what other people believe and also why we disagree with them. And so we don't feel like it's worth discussing anymore. This is especially pertinent when you look at people with who ostensibly have very lively religious disagreements who don't feel that it's important to talk about them. That is, they sort of politely sort of paper over the causes of their disagreement because they believe it would be too acrimonious and too difficult to actually carry on a reasonable conversation about why they hold those disagreements. And the third reason is I think there's a kind of false diversity of perspective that doesn't admit for a genuine diversity of opinion. And what I mean by that is that we presume that everyone has different ways of seeing the world, but we don't assume that we don't give credibility to the notion that people have legitimate reasons for disagreeing and coming to radically different conclusions about them. And in fact, I think we tend to find, in the case of Jordan Peterson especially, that when people do have radically different views about the world, when they challenge our fundamental assumptions, it can be seen as very dangerous, not necessarily in a violent way, but in a sense that it subverts our polite expectations of conformity to certain opinions that have a currency and serve to ameliorate our social tensions.
Right. I don't know. In my experience, I think there are some places where you do have this kind of homogeneous thinking nowadays, but it's not everywhere. I think that was actually one of the things that I was kind of impressed when, so before right now I'm a postdoc here in Brasilia, but before that I was in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University. And a genuine difference of opinions was something that really impressed me there. That there you could have, of course, I mean everyone's at each other's throats, but they are arguing. And so I think it's also a matter of where in the world you are right now. And with regard to the ancient world, I don't know. I mean, people are aware of each other, but there's not necessarily so much communication. So, for instance, Proclus, the philosopher I specialize in, seems to not absorb anything of Christian philosophy, right? And he can read Latin. We know this from his biography, but I've never detected any influence of an author who wrote in Latin on him. And but it is true that that in late antiquity there is this multicultural environment, right? So Platonists have Syrians and Greeks and people and Egyptians. So there's people from all over the Roman Empire that are participating in this. But I don't know how much dialogue there is between opposing camps.
Oh, that's interesting. So maybe we can flesh that out as we go on. I was under the impression that the subjects of our study, in particular the sort of Alexandrian late antique milieu, had quite a bit of back and forth between the various camps. But I guess before we get all the way there, we should introduce the topic a little bit better. In Christian history, for example, or at least in Western culture, there has been this kind of how do you put it, a sort of ambiguous or fraught relationship between philosophy and religion, where in some quarters, in some places, and sometimes all of philosophy is regarded suspiciously, and then in other times it's freely embraced, dialogued with, played with. There's a kind of room for maneuver. And something that really shocks me is that even today in 2021, you have theologians and people like this who just have a very flat, two-dimensional conception of, for example, Greek philosophy. It's just this like pagan endeavor that has nothing to do with their religion. And I mean, just on a historical level, that doesn't make any sense. But I think it also speaks to a kind of ignorance that prevails regarding what antiquity is, like what is Platonism. So I guess before we kind of consider how do different traditions or different worldviews dialogue, borrow or not dialogue, etc., maybe Antonio should tell us what Platonism actually is.
Right. Okay. I can give a bird's eye view of the subject. So, right. Well, Platonism starts with Plato, right, and the in the 5th-4th century BC in Athens, and Plato is, of course, a great writer and a philosopher. What he actually thought is unclear because the works that we have of his are all written in dialogue form where he doesn't himself speak. But we do have some inklings because we have reports from other people, especially his student Aristotle. And so he authors his dialogues, 27 if I'm not mistaken, all in total, and he establishes an educational institution which is the academy. And Diogenes Laertius gives us consistent, like a succession of heads of the academy, all the way down to shortly before Antiochus of Ascalon, and then we have a few more, and then it's destroyed in 86 BC, right, by the Roman dictator Sulla when he sieges Athens. But what's important here is that Plato's views aren't treated as gospel. They're not treated as a unique source of authority. People in the early academy, his immediate successor, even his nephew Speusippus, are happy to disagree with him on subjects like what is the first principle, right? So we know that one issue that he was concerned of was this: he has this project that he lays out in the Republic, that of through dialectic, through philosophical argumentation, reaching a conception of the first principle, which he thinks is the good, and then from there deriving all the hypotheses needed for knowledge, for episteme. And he thought that this first principle was the good and that it was identical with the one, and his successors don't accept that, right? They think that that's untenable. And Aristotle, for instance, no longer holds that the first principle is the one, and Specificus no longer holds that it's the good. And the first academicians have many different views about what are first principles, what are the forms, and why they're needed, and what kinds of beings exist. We do know that, however, although he wasn't authority, what the Academy did interpret Plato's dialogues, and at some point when the Academy becomes skeptical, it also produces a skeptical interpretation of Plato's dialogues, so that he actually did not hold to any dogmata or any theses. So there's this tradition of teaching that happens in Athens, and I said it comes to an end in before Christ. Later, Marcus Aurelius institutes chairs of philosophy in Athens, and that includes, for the four main schools, the Platonists, the Peripatetics, the Aristotelians, the Stoics, and the Epicureans. But so there's not, and then there you again get consistent teaching of Platonism in Athens for a while, and then in the 4th century, we know that Plutarch of Athens restarts this, and Athens again becomes a center for Platonist thought. So there's not, when we talk about Platonism, we're not talking about some kind of unbroken tradition of thought, and we're talking about inheritors that try to interpret the same text or same group of texts. And
Well, actually, I would like to stop you right there for just one question, which is, I think this point itself is hotly debated, is it not?
Which?
Because you've just defined Platonism as starting with Plato and elaborating through a series of interpreters of texts.
Whereas, there are people who would associate Platonism. I mean, there is a use of Platonism nowadays, which means that which means a certain set of ideas, right? Like the idea that what is truly real are the forms, things that we understand through nonsensible means, and that the good or the one is the cause of all things. And Lloyd Gerson, I think he has these 5 ideas of what makes a philosophy Platonist, but I'm just referring to, when I present the note, this is a tradition of interpretation, I'm just thinking, like, if you, in antiquity, if people said, oh, the Platonists, what would they mean, right?
Because what I want to contest is that, at least in my own reflection, what I think it is that Plato is a sage, and that he learned wisdom from Pythagoreans, from people in Mesopotamia, from Egypt. So he's a kind of bizarre mystic who people, he is like a guru, right? And teaching his pupils. And there's this kind of tradition that's passed on of this sort of mystical, what we consider philosophy today is, of course, the discussion and analysis of texts. But I think for them, it would have been much closer to something like a form of life, no?
Oh, it's certainly a form of life, but it's nothing guru-like. I mean, we know from Aristotle that his immediate successors disagreed with him on basic things. They did not view him as some kind of guru. But Ryan has something to say.
Yes, well, these are two contrasting views of Plato that flourished in antiquity. So the view that you're describing, Henry, I believe, was something that was advocated by a group that was described as the Neo-Pythagoreans, specifically Eudorus of Rhodes and Moderatus of Gades, had attempted to find in Plato the sort of the inheritor and the representer and the rehabilitator of an ancient Pythagorean wisdom that traced its lineage back to the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Indians. This, however, was something of another reinterpretation and a kind of hagiographic representation of Plato's thought in a more consistent way than you ever find in the dialogues. So I think that Antonio's point is just to say that we have this body of work that is come down to us from Plato, a very comprehensive and expansive body of dialogues, all of which are very amorphous and difficult to understand and interpret, but for which successive generations have reinterpreted for their own purposes. And what's exciting about Platonism in that regard is not that there's a single Platonism, not that there's a single sort of golden mystical perennial tradition that we can all tap into, but rather that it's something that is always being reinterpreted for new purposes, for new religious ends, for new mystical ends, even for new philosophical ends. And this is something that's happened over and over again. We can point, for instance, to Middle Platonism, to Neoplatonism, beginning with Plotinus. We can point to the Christian tradition, which I'm an expert on. We can point to Florentine Platonism, or we can point even to a kind of Kabbalic mysticism that flourishes even today.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on, both of you would disagree with me that the fundamental mode of teaching was non-written.
Well, it's certainly true that Plato taught orally, and he also claims in the Phaedrus and also in the contested seventh letter that the primary mode of teaching is oral teaching. The Phaedrus concludes a very famous critique of writing as a dead medium that cannot answer to questions. And we also have from Aristotle a testimonia of what is described as his unwritten teachings, which has been variously elaborated by other ancient testimonia, as well as by commentators on Plato. So it's certainly true that he, as it were, he privileged orality and dialogue over didactic written word. That being said, he also, and this is the paradox of a strictly sort of esoteric teaching of Plato, is that he comprehensively wrote down very extensive dialogues that attest to various opinions that he and his students or people that he knew or people that he knew held. So it's not as if he wasn't writing. He committed to writing so many opinions. It's just that he didn't commit a single one of those opinions as his own belief or that he held had to be held by any of his students.
Right. And also, it's important when you talk about the unwritten teachings that Aristotle refers to them as the so-called legomena unwritten teachings. And there are scholars like Kenneth Sayre who think he says so-called because you can actually find them in some of the dialogues, right? That you can actually find them in the Statesman and other dialogues. So, I mean, sure, the main way of teaching will be oral and it will be discussion, but I don't think that there is some kind of body of teaching that's handed down from Plato. And Plato's opinions are just that. They're his hypotheses, and people were welcome to criticize or disagree. Ryan, you want to jump in?
Yes, for a long time there's been a dichotomy in Plato interpretation between an esoteric reading of Plato and an exoteric reading of Plato. This dichotomy arguably originates with Friedrich Schleiermacher's interpretation of Plato, and Schleiermacher is seen as representative of the exoteric interpretation, whereby we can only interpret Plato on the basis of the written remains of his dialogues. To the contrary, the Tübingen school of Plato interpretation has advocated an esoteric position, which has also been advanced by the Straussians from University of Chicago in another way. But I tend to think that this entire dichotomy collapses when you look at the way in which Plato taught and the way that the way that Plato taught in the academy. And there's one singular counterexample that I wanted to mention, which is that it's reported by Aristotle and other ancient testimonia that Plato gave a lecture called On the Good, where he expounded his systematic philosophy in public, which is to say that whatever he was teaching orally to his students and whatever he was, as it were, hiding between the lines of his dialogues was in fact presented to a public audience. However, Aristotle also reports that it was met with ridicule, derision, and misunderstanding, which, considering the complexity of Plato's thought and the fate of Socrates, is not so surprising.
Right.
So if we have this, if you go on Wikipedia, they'll have this neat historiography of Plato, early Platonism, the Skeptical Academy, Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism. Antonio, do you think there's any value in that, or was it multiform and variegated from the beginning?
I mean, these categories are useful just to put people in boxes and help us refer to them, but I don't know. So let me talk about what I know best, which is this Neoplatonism, right? So so all these people that you mentioned call themselves Platonists, right? And and people say that Plotinus is then the founder of Neoplatonism. It's true that Plotinus is like a new beginning for Platonism, right? So, and he is not only a new beginning for Platonism, he's a new beginning for ancient philosophy of the of ancient philosophy. The two philosophers that we have complete works of are Plato and Plotinus, right? Handed down entirely. And Eunapius, Eunapius is a later person who writes a history of sophists and philosophers, and he's a bit on the hagiographical side, but he tells us that people were reading Plotinus more than they were reading Plato. And so Plotinus inaugurates, is influenced by this Neo-Pythagorean trend that Ryan mentioned. So he does have this idea of Plato as a sage, and agreeing with these other sources of Oriental wisdom, something that could develop later, and he believes that there is not that there are important non-verbal forms of knowledge, right, through nous and through unity with the first principle, but and that you can't even properly write them down, and but I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted. The question of is this to what degree this division is useful, and I think it, in the sense that ancients also saw a division here, is important. But it's important also to remember that Plotinus recognized that he had teachers of his own. It talks about Ammonius Saccus, or Porphyry talks about Ammonius Saccus, who was his teacher. And at the beginning of his teaching career in Rome, he spent most of the time teaching the philosophy of Ammonius. We know that there is an Origin who was a colleague of Plotinus's, but there's a debate about whether it's if it's the same origin as the Christian theologian. Ryan, do you have views on this?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's a long-standing controversy about the identity of Origin, or the two origins, as they're called. One is identified as the Christian origin, of which we have voluminous writings, and the other is identified as the so-called pagan origin, of which nothing remains. There's a number of reasons for this controversy. The controversy emerged in the 19th century. I forget the exact scholar who raised the first question. For most of the reception of Origin, there had only been one sort of recognition of Origin. In fact, this was the interpretation of the Florentine Platonists and the Cambridge Platonists. So it's a long-standing interpretation. However, at the apogee of sort of German historical scholarship, people started to recognize discrepancies both with the dates and with the titles that were attributed to the so-called pagan origin. Now, the difficulty was, first of all, there was a discrepancy in the date at which some of the titles were said to have been written. There's also a discrepancy with Eusebius's chronology of when Origen died. And the difficulty here is because he seems to misplace the date of the emperor under whom Origen was persecuted and died under torture. With that aside, the other issue is that titles are attributed to the pagan origin that aren't attributed to the Christian origin, and some of these concern daemonology. Now, this isn't so difficult, I think, because it's reported by Jerome that Origen had written a vast number of works, of which very little survives. Something like 80% of it is lost. And we don't know the full extent of his writings, or some of his writings have alternative names. Furthermore, and this is my contention, that most of the testimonia about the pagan origin can be plausibly interpreted in regard to the Christian origin. And there's one peculiar case of this. Well, there's two cases I want to mention very briefly. One is that Porphyry, who knew both of these figures, or only the one origin, if you say that there's one origin, has two conflicting opinions of them. That is, on the one hand, he's very critical of the so-called Christian origin. On the other hand, he doesn't say anything critical about the so-called pagan origin. This I don't think is so difficult, because in most cases where we have complex and contested relationships with people, we don't have a uniform opinion of them, and we could say something praiseworthy on the one hand, something very critical on the other hand. It also strikes me as peculiar that in a city like Alexandria, of course a very large city, very cosmopolitan city, where all of the academics and intellectuals presumably would know of one another, at least if not know one another in person, as you would in any great intellectual center, that no one at the time would have been clear enough to make a firm distinction between these two people. The way that it strikes me, it's a bit like if you lived in Berlin and you knew of Schleiermacher or you knew of Schelling, and you said you only referred to Schelling, but you didn't make a distinction between the Catholic Schelling or the Protestant Schelling, or you said there were two different Schellings because they had two different sort of eras. They don't necessarily need to be the same different people to have different opinions at different times, or different opinions of them. And the third reason is most of the things that are said about the the pagan origin could also be just as well said about the Christian origin. And one of the reasons for this is that Origen had a very extensive library of classical and pagan philosophers. In fact, it's reported by Gregory Thaumaturgus that he taught pagan philosophy and that he attracted philosophy students from the school of Porphyry and Plotinus to his school, which suggests that he could have easily written treatises on demonology and many other subjects that were prevalent among pagan philosophers.
Oh, that's really interesting. I had never gone into this debate because it hadn't been relevant to my research yet. But one last thing to say about Neoplatonism is to say it is a creation of 19th century German historiography, this term Neoplatonism. And the point is to say it's not actually Platonism. And why is it important for them to say that it's not actually Platonism? It's because what was called Platonism for most of them after Plotinus becomes active and through late antiquity and the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, what gets called Platonism is what we would call Neoplatonism, because the Neoplatonists are really the interpreters that leave their mark on what Platonism means and what is the meaning of Plato. And actually they are committed to drawing from the dialogues and also the reports of Plato's unwritten beliefs a single systematic view that makes sense of everything. And I think that if you try to do that with the dialogues and find what is Plato's philosophy and think that in all the dialogues there's one philosophy that's being transmitted, you will end up with something very close to Neoplatonists.
And before we go back to Origen, because what I want to kind of do is steer back to the question of Origen in order to really get in on this question of dialogue, debate, borrowing. But I want to bring Neoplatonism to its sort of conclusion, if there is one. And, you were speaking about various different perspectives. We have figures like, you're an expert on Proclus, we have Iamblichus, we have Damascius, we have all these people. But we also have figures showing up as late as the Renaissance in Italy, who are Neoplatonist pagans, who are just practicing a kind of pagan tachia, right? And they're pretending to be like Greek Orthodox or whatever. Talk to us about, I don't know. You all tell me. I abandoned academia a long time ago. Personally, I think that Ficino probably understood Platonism better than some 19th century German. What do you all make of this?
Well, sure, you can talk about the long, Neoplatonism as this long tradition that goes through the Renaissance. And even Hegel, when he talks about Proclus, he raves about him. He had a completely correct understanding of threeness. And I prefer just to think about Platonism like when I study Platonism, I think about it going until Damascius, right, the last head of the Platonic Academy at Athens. And so to just flesh this out, so what Plotinus's big innovation, probably with regard to other philosophers, and which we know that his colleague Origen did not accept, right, was the idea that the first principle was not nous, right, was not a being that makes itself intelligible and that illuminates others. Rather, he says that the first principle is something absolutely simple, and which he calls tohen. You can say the one, but there's problems with that. I prefer just calling it unity, the abstract. The one makes it seem like it's one thing, and I think it's supposed to be the source of things being one. So I don't think it can itself just be a single thing. But anyway, so he has this triadic explanation of the world, that you have unity, and from unity you get nous, intelligence, reason, and from nous, soul, psyche, and then the world. He has many opinions that later Platonists don't accept, right? So he thinks that all souls are somehow sisters on the same level. He thinks that there's a part of the soul that's always contemplating the intelligibles. And he thinks that matter itself is evil. These are all things that he taught, and that later Platonists don't accept. But they do accept this general view of reality, like the broad structure. And then an important, and his views get, his texts are edited by his student Porphyry, who also has works of his own. But then another important hallmark then is Iamblichus, the Syrian philosopher, who what he really introduces to Neoplatonism are a few things. He introduces the Platonic curriculum. So this is important for understanding what Platonism means, right? He develops a sequence of 10 dialogues to be read in order, plus 2 final ones that encapsulate all Platonic philosophy, the Parmenides and Timaeus. And he also introduced the idea that each dialogue has a scopus. It has one target, and everything in that dialogue has to be interpreted as saying something about that target. So, for instance, the Timaeus is about physiologia, it's about physics. So that means everything in the Timaeus, even the myth of Atlantis, has to somehow be about physics. And he also introduces the defense of theurgy, right? Theurgy is a word coined an analogy with theology, God working, and the idea is it's the catch-all term for ritual practice and prayer for late Neoplatonists. And there's an important, and Iamblichus and the Platonists that follow him think that ritual activity is essential for the flourishing, complete human life. And they think that contact with the gods is important for union with this first principle. And there are some interpretations that say that the first principle is in some way identical with the gods in these later Platonists, especially Proclus. This is disputed and is unclear. I think his work can be interpreted in different directions. And then just to get to Proclus, so then Proclus is then from the 5th century AD, and he is the most systematic Neoplatonist we have. We don't know exactly to what degree his views are his own, because he attributes many of them to his teacher Syrianus, from whom we don't have much material, many texts. But he writes extensive commentaries on a number of Platonic dialogues, and he produces 2 works: the Platonic Theology, which we have incomplete, which systematizes everything Plato says about the gods. And also he writes the elements of theology, or elements of metaphysics, which is the earliest example of a metaphysics modo geometrico we have, proposition proof, and with later propositions building on earlier ones. And the stuff that Proclus proves here will then become just axiomatic and taken for granted by many later philosophers in the Middle Ages. So just to give a short.
Mm-hmm. So we've kind of gone from Plato and Socrates and Pythagoras to Proclus and Platon and all these other people. One more sort of background question I want to answer before we focus on Origen and Plotinus is, we spoke at the beginning a lot about Athens, right? And, Marcus Aurelius appointing chairs. And then we ended up in Alexandria. And then we ended up back in Athens again with Damascus. To what degree do these schools or these worldviews, to what degree are they geographically limited at all?
Well, it depends on, again, how you interpret Platonism and its geographical scope. So it's certainly true that the schools were taught in very limited places. That is, unlike today where you can travel very quickly, people could only communicate in their immediate vicinity or had to travel by boat at long distance and over a long time in order to meet with anyone else. There's another sense, however, in which as early as the pre-Socratics, we find that there's an incredible cross-Mediterranean communication between people at different schools. We find, for instance, responses given by people in Italy to people in Asia Minor, and the works of Athenian philosophers are read all over the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was a kind of superhighway of communication. In another sense, the works of previous Platonic philosophers could be collected and read by people elsewhere. So, for instance, the works of the Platonic Academy could be read in Athens or could be read in Alexandria, and Alexandria could become then a new hub of philosophical speculation that carried on the works of their predecessors. In this sense, even though Plato was suspicious of writing becomes a kind of principal vehicle for the transmission and the codification and collection and commentary on previous works of philosophers. In this sense, I don't think it's so surprising that we have a continual dialogue between different schools of thought emerging in different places that are in common conversation about the legacy of Plato. You mentioned Iamblichus. Iamblichus is from Syria, and Plotinus and Porphyry, they took up residence in Rome. So all the way across the Mediterranean basin, there was this kind of discussion. Another thing that is, I think, of importance to remember is that there's also a kind of temporal extension and recollection that occurs over and over here. So in each case, what's happening is that we're not only interpreting our immediate predecessors, but also the grand tradition that they come from. That is, what lineage they follow from, who are their inspirations, and how do we reconstruct a body of thought that draws from the past. We find this already in Plato's Parmenides, where Plato goes so far as to represent his own thought as the inheritance vis-a-vis Socrates of Parmenides, who's presented as the teacher not only of Zeno of Elea, but also of Socrates and by extension of Plato. Later on, Philo and the Christians will argue that Moses was the teacher of Pythagoras, who taught Parmenides, who taught Socrates, who taught Plato, making Moses, as it were, for Mosaic wisdom, the source of inspiration ultimately for Christian theology. And this effort of rehabilitation or retrospective reinterpretation is continually ongoing, which allows for subsequent schools and subsequent authors to continually recast their own thoughts in the mold of Platonic philosophy, that is, in the golden tradition that comes from Athens unto the present.
I think Ryan's covered it well. And what I can add is simply that in later antiquity, we actually have two operating schools of Platonism, right? There's a school in Athens and there's a school in Alexandria, right? So we talk about Alexandrian Neoplatonism, we talk about Athenian Neoplatonism. So, for instance, John Philoponus and Olympiodorus are in Alexandria, and as opposed to Proclus and Damascus and Simplicius up in Athens. And some scholars have tried to draw clear distinctions between these two schools, but in general, it's true. It was a very multicultural thing with people all around the Mediterranean participating in this discussion.
And how incongruous among, for example, the Hellenistic schools would the language and the grammar they use be? Because when I read a certain text, I get this impression that people are very capable of sort of switching their terminology around and kind of just freely cribbing from wherever. And it's like, is he using these words in a Stoic way? Is it in a Platonic way? How does this all relate to each other?
Well, this is one of the great questions that classicists invariably have. So one of the challenges is that most of philosophy draws from technical terms that are the summation of previous dialogue and previous elaborations and contestation by previous schools of philosophy. So, for instance, when we use the term participation or methexis, we're referring to a theory that Plato had developed, probably derived in part from the Pythagoreans, then variously contested by Aristotle and rehabilitated by the Middle Platonists. And so all philosophy is in dialogue with and rehabilitates and repurposes the terminology of its predecessors. What's curious, however, is when philosophers deliberately invent new terms to designate new concepts. And this happens repeatedly, but also momentously. And one of the points at which we can recognize a rupture, as well as points of retrospective repurposing, is when philosophers, on the one hand, have new terms that they introduce to capture the new concepts they've developed or their contemporaries have developed. On the other hand, when they recharacterize their predecessors using their own concepts, that is, using the language of their own time. So one of the ways, for instance, that people have recognized the sort of forgery of the Neo-Pythagoreans is when Pythagoras is said to believe things that only people after Aristotle could believe, or only things that only concepts and terms that flourished in the early imperial period that would have been used. Probably the most famous example of this is Pseudo-Dionysius, was claimed by Christians for centuries, up until the time of Thomas Aquinas, to have been a first century follower of Paul and the Bishop of Athens. But he appears to use language and even paraphrase sections from Proclus's Elements, which shows that he couldn't possibly have been a first century writer, considering he's in many ways copying from Proclus.
Although it takes a while for that to sink in, right? Nicholas of Cusa still thinks that Pseudo-Dionysius is from the first century because he dates Proclus back to before Christ. And so he thinks, it's no problem that Dionysius had access to this. So there's this, and it's something that's often important to track what terminology people are using sometimes, because terminology can have widely different meanings, right? Ousia, for instance, in Platonic and Aristotelian usages, it means the substance, or essence of a thing. In Stoic terminology, it means matter, right? For instance, Aristotle draws a sharp distinction between kinesis, change, and energia, activity, which, however, isn't followed by Plato, and then later Platonic philosophers debate this. Yeah.
So whether or not origin was the pagan origin, or there were two origins, or whatever, let's get into this Alexandrian milieu in particular, and try to dig into this in particular. So maybe Ryan, you already started to speak about Origin. Do you want to introduce him a little bit more here?
Yes, it's important to remember that Ammonius Saccas, the teacher of Plotinus, is also attributed to be the teacher of Origin, and this also has been contested, but it's generally doesn't receive as much criticism as the notion of one Origin. So, assuming that Origin had the same teacher of Ammonius Saccas, there is a common lineage here. In a certain sense, they have the same Dr. Vater. They're brothers of the same school, and assuming then that they shared a similar intellectual background or teaching, the question emerges as what did they learn from Ammonius Saccas? What did they learn from Alexandrian Platonism? And at what point did they depart? Because obviously there are many points of disagreement between Origen and Plotinus, and later Platonic tradition on the one hand and the Christian tradition on the other hand. And I take it that, and as Antonio mentioned, that one of the primary points of disagreement will be the unity of the first principle. That is, whether the first principle is one and not many, or whether it is both one and many. And the reason why this is going to become of focal importance is, first of all, Origen is in many ways one of the architects of what will become Nicene Cappadocian Christian Trinitarian theology. The primary reason for this is that he repurposes the Valentinian Gnostic notion of the hypostases, and he attributes that to the Son, to Sophia, to Logos, and to the Holy Spirit. And in doing so, he's going to develop a triadic relation between the hypostases of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit that will later become the basis for the anti-subordinationist and equal representation of the essential relations of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the Christian Trinity. Now, with this being said, he also stands in stark contrast to the Plotinus tradition that emphasizes the absolute unity and simplicity and unspeakability of Tuhin, or the one before being and before intellect. And Origen famously also will characterize the Son as the seat of the epinoia, or the aspects or attributes by which we can come to speak not only of the Son, but also in virtue of how the Son is the image of the Father, also of the Father, and vice versa, of the Holy Spirit, altogether as one in one God. And this then means that Origen is going to attribute intellect and being to the Son, and by virtue of attributing to the Son, also to the image of the Father, which means that he's ultimately going to attribute things to God the Father that could not be admitted by Plotinus, for whom the one is absolutely unspeakable and ineffable and unthinkable.
Right, yeah. Ryan brings up this important question of the presence of Gnostic texts and thinkers in this period. So we know that there were Gnostic students in Plotinus's classes, right, and in Plotinus's school, and he wrote a treatise against the Gnostics. He also had students of his, like Porphyry, write treatises against certain Gnostic texts and views. And Porphyry, who also wrote against the Christians, and we know that from Zeke Mazur, right, who passed away recently, far too young, that Plotinus's account of how the soul is united with unity in the first principle tracks very closely some Gnostic texts and their accounts of union and ascent. And although the texts that we have of these Scythian Gnostics are usually, bereft of argument. So what's really unique here about Plotinus is that he's doing something similar to what these texts are describing, also some texts in the Greek magical papyri, but he thinks that philosophical education and argument are, an important step of this ascent. And Um, but just to also show how Gnosticism is here in the background for Plotinus as well.
Well, actually, that's a very good point that you did that, because we actually have multiple factions, and we haven't even covered the factional landscape. We have sort of Origen and the catechetical school at Alexandria is at least one faction. We have Plotinus and his students as one faction. We have the Gnostics as some kind of other faction. I assume there are still, Jewish descendants of Philo, spiritual descendants of Philo, hanging around, and we have polemics going, against the Gnostics, against the Jews, against the Christians, going back and forth, zinging. To what degree? I mean, you just mentioned, Antonio, there is this overlap of, well, people could be Plotinus students and also Gnostics. How much overlap is there with these factions? Like, how many? I mean, conceivably, if the two origins are in fact one, then he's in multiple camps at the same time. How does that? How would people relate to that conception of what camp or what faction are they part of?
I don't think if you study with someone, you're not necessarily in their camp, right? I think, of course, the closer students are students who do identify with the teacher, but there are pagan Neoplatonists teaching Christians, and there's it's. I don't think necessarily that you think that there's an overlap of camps because there's an overlap of schools.
Of course, it's very difficult to say who identifies with what tradition. If you're taught by someone, that is a good indicator, but certainly not necessarily leading you to be affiliate or partisan of their thought. I mean, we find many philosophers, for instance, Aristotle famously said that he loves his teacher Plato, but he loves the truth more. So you can be a student of Plato and have radically divergent opinions from him. That being said, there are sort of certain markers of this. So part of the challenge is to see how it is that a philosophical school becomes a tradition and how a tradition becomes exclusive. And if you say that religion is a philosophical school and that there's not a firm distinction in this time period between religion and philosophy, following Pierre Hadot, then it's possible to say that religion gradually becomes more exclusive over time. And one of the reasons I think it does is, especially in the time of Origen, there's persecutions of Christians, and there's a test that's made of Christians as to whether they are themselves authentically Christian, that is, whether they're willing to sacrifice to the emperor. That is, if they sacrifice to the emperor, they are not abiding by the sort of dictates of Paul that refuses pagan sacrifices. And I think that's one of the cultural markers. It's not so much that they don't share intellectual influences, or they're not in conversation, obviously they are, but rather what they're willing to do and how they're willing to perform their identity through various ritual means.
And what really marks somebody in this time period as a part of this or that tradition, other than being a student of so and so? I feel like today there's this kind of, popular notion that, you have these beliefs, like an ensemble or a set of beliefs, and that there's another list out there somewhere of different ideologies or worldviews or camps. And then you just take your sort of list of propositions that you hold and you compare them with this sets of propositions. And then, okay, well, you're a Republican, you're a fan of Bolsonaro, whatever, you have your different, you categorize that way. But I don't think that has anything to do really with a tradition, because a tradition is obviously something that can only be mediated through teacher-student relationships.
One of the remarkable things about this time is that both the school of Plotinus or Ammonius and Origen and the Christian bishops are both attempting to formulate what would be considered a systematic or doxastic criteria for belonging. So in the case of Origen, there's obviously a previously what they call the rule of faith tradition, where there are certain rules and teachings of Christianity that are recited in the Christian liturgy and also are held to be a requirement for Christian baptism and belonging. But at this time, there's as yet no developed body of literature that we can recognize as systematic theology. Arguably, Clement of Alexandria, before Origen, had provided some of the essential requirements for this. But Origen of Alexandria's On First Principles has been widely recognized as the first work of Christian systematic theology. That is, a first work of literature that attempts to define all of Christian doctrine and analytically demonstrate those doctrines from first principles. It's in this way, it anticipates and is in many ways parallel to the efforts of Proclus many centuries later. And Plotinus can be seen as a counterpoint to this. That is a person who, obviously edited by Porphyry in the Enneads, but whose writings will then be gathered up by his students and represented as an orthodox and systematic interpretation of the Platonic legacy. So the difficulty of saying that a person belongs to either tradition is that we don't, as it were, have any firm systematic criteria by which to either say who belongs or who doesn't belong to those traditions. All of this comes before, and all of the criteria for distinguishing between people and belonging to different traditions will come later.
Moreover, I mean, Pierre Hadot has been mentioned, and of course, its philosophy here is more than merely holding a set of propositions to be true, right? So there will be also practical effects in your life that people practice. So the vegetarianism is practiced within Platonist school as a sign of, part of the Pythagorean legacy, and also it's connected with their belief in the immortality of the soul, and the idea that, and some of them believe that souls can transmigrate into animals, and so it's also a matter of a way of life, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but in the last episode of Forms, I talked to my friend Malik about the Druze community and their conceptions of transmigration, which, as far as I can tell, are very Neoplatonic, very directly. And the way that the Druze sages live, like that, the Druze sheikhs, is they live these kind of ascetic lives where they try not to sleep, they try not to eat, they do these forms of extreme asceticism. And when I consider, my friends that might live on a Christian monastery, or if I consider the life of Origen or the life of Plotinus or multiple of these figures, they're all ascetics. And so when I think about their actual mode of life, the actual things that they do, the way that they live their philosophy, it seems to resemble each other far more than it resembles, my teachers at, the university or whatever. And I just wonder, to what degree can we even intuit that world? Can we even imagine ourselves in that world? Because at least for me, it just seems like if you were to ask somebody, are you a teacher? Like, it's all about who are you in relation to with personally? How do you personally live? And this is a very foreign, as you were saying, Antonio, it's very foreign to this kind of propositional assumptions that we have today.
Yes, Origin of Alexandria is very emphatic that the heights of intellectual contemplation and wisdom cannot be achieved without a pure heart of pure practice that follows the dictates of his religion. And this is important because it means that there is as yet no firm distinction between the ascetic life that will develop in the monastic movement a century later and intellectual or philosophical life that he himself is representing through his writings. This, of course, is not a new distinction. We find, for instance, in Plato's Phaedo, Socrates representing an ascetic lifestyle that is the culmination of philosophical wisdom. But ever since the monastic movement, and increasingly with the secularization of academic philosophy, we've tended to think that these two could be drawn apart. So, for instance, if you look at the case of Peter Abelard and Bernardo Clairvaux, you think that there are two completely separate lifestyles that can only mix in a kind of conflictual way. For people of the time, however, they would have thought that that practice is the fulfillment outwardly of an interior spiritual life, and that each of them were mutually complementary, serving the same ends.
Right, indeed, and you see this also in Damascus's commentary on the Phaedo. He was the last head of the Platonic Academy, and there it's very clear that you have to have a certain level of virtue, you have to develop certain moral habits in order for you to be a successful philosopher, in order for you to actually engage in contemplation, know the forms, and so on. But of course, something that's important for these later Platonists is that part of this lifestyle will involve sacrificing to the gods. It will involve petitions to the gods. You cannot be successful in anything in life without divine aid. That's actually something that's already like something that characterizes Platonist philosophers already before Plotinus, this theme of the necessity of divine aid, and the importance of piety as a virtue. It distinguishes them from other schools, the emphasis that they lay on this. But so there, although you can say that there are similarities. There's this common ascetic lifestyle. There's this common ascetic maybe ideal. The ideal is not identical, as, for instance, it will include certain forms of worship in one and not in the other. And in general, there's not much of a communication, because there's generally there's not an acceptance that other people are genuinely doing also philosophy. So there's Platonists seem solemnly uninterested in what Christians are doing, and Christians are not interested in the allegorical interpretations that Plato's pagan followers are doing of of their rites and myths. And generally, you get these polemics that portray the pagan myths as entirely devoid of a higher intellectual content.
So we have this overlap, but then there's the area outside of the overlap. So when you say they're not interested in what each other are doing, you mean regarding to ritual practices or just too core?
Of course, they are concerned with what each other are. Proclus is obviously concerned that he's no longer living, that he doesn't live in a pagan polity, that it's been a Christian empire for a while. His biographer dates his death from Julian the Apostate's reign, right? So there is this concern, but there isn't, they're not reading each other's texts. I don't, at least.
What do you make of the theory that Pseudo-Dionysius just is Damascus?
There's a problem with saying that Pseudo-Dionysius is even influenced by Damascus, because if he is, then that means that he is sure. Okay, we found evidence of their thoughts similar to Damascus in Pseudo-Dionysius, but then no one between Proclus and Damascus seems to be an influence, right? There's a leap there, and I don't know. I'm very cautious about interpreting Plato, and I think it's really hard to know what Plato meant. And with regard to Pseudo-Dionysius, I think it's really hard to know who this person was. And I think, okay, we can have many theories, but...
So we have, at least to go back to the Christian side a little bit, there's this concept of the plundering of the Egyptians, which is the sort of free use and reappropriation of pagan learning, etc. And to bring it back to the kind of popular level, I think a lot of it's often taught, honestly, and said and repeated that the apostolic fathers, the early Christian writers, etc., they were doing a kind of an apologetics, and so they were using this sort of pagan language. So in this telling, pagan and Platonistic is just the same thing. There's no tension between those two words at all. They're just equivocal. And they're using it in order to explain the truths of Christianity, which are assumed to be this kind of pre-existing thing that you can express in a Platonistic language, right? And, they're just trying to relate to their culture, right? So they're actually like 20th century evangelicals in terms of trying to get, people on board, get them in, get them dunked, so to speak. And I really personally, I doubt this. And so when I look at the plundering of the Egyptians, what I kind of see is the same sort of divergence. And feel free to disagree with me, both of you, by the way. I'm not any kind of person to pronounce on this, but I see Christianity and Judaism as a kind of fork in the road. And we have, practices, etc. Second Temple Judaism is no longer extant. So whatever happened with Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, they're both coming from the same source that no longer exists. And so when I look at Origen and Plotinus, for example, I see the same kind of forking in the road, where I don't think that Origen, this might be a hot take, I don't think Origen is trying to use Platonism. I just think he is a Platonist, but he's also a Christian. What do you all make of this?
Absolutely. That's a very well-stated summary of the position that he holds. I think the challenge is that, on the one hand, the Christians, like the Jews, have a different body of revelatory scripture that they can call upon as an authoritative text to arbitrate different philosophical questions. However, on the other hand, and I think especially for the Christians, they don't believe that Greek philosophy stands anterior to or antagonistically opposed to Christian theology, at least not after Clement. There was a debate in the second century about this very question. But I take it that Origen is free to use the philosophical inheritance of the Greeks precisely because he thinks that it's part of the same Mosaic wisdom that's communicated by Solomon, and part of the same logos that's been communicated to different cultures through different angelic media over time. And the important point here is that he thinks that there's one Sophia, there's one logos that's communicated on the one hand through Greek philosophy, on the other hand through Christian scripture, and that Greek philosophy is a way of learning about the interior meaning that is hidden under the veil of enigmatic statements in Christian scripture, and for which we need the best tools of learning, the best Greek philosophy, the best science in order to unpack and discover. Now, of course, this is something that later is going to become a point of contention because it could be accused, for instance, by Jerome and Epiphanius of holding too firmly to Greek philosophy. But I think part of the reason for suspicion is that there's some bewilderment and confusion about the Greek inheritance that Origen adopts, and also the purposes he uses it in his interpretation of scripture and development of systematic theology. So I take it that this polemic against Greek philosophy is in many ways anti-intellectual and withholds philosophy, that is, withholds reflection from the possibility of interpretation of scripture on the one hand and development of theology on the other.
Right. I think, I don't know. So in the sense that he is receiving Platonic texts and interpreting them, sure, he's a Platonist, but I think that there's when these Platonic texts get interpreted by Christians, then there's a tendency then to not take seriously things that seem really present in the text. So, for instance, piety towards the gods is present throughout most of Plato's dialogues. There is an accusation of impiety against Socrates for introducing new gods. But his last words are, "Oh, we need to sacrifice a cock to Asclepius in the Phaedo." And the most important laws in the Republic are supposed to be the laws that the Apollo and his oracle will dictate about how to deal with oracles and how to make sure that they're not bribed. And I think that there's, I mean, you compared it to the separation between rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, and I think that it is also similar in that sense too, in the sense that Christians present themselves as the fulfillment of Judaism, and then they present Christ as the fulfillment of Platonic philosophy, right? And there's a similar gesture of appropriation in both cases.
And I would go further to say that I don't think the New Testament makes sense without Greek philosophy. Like John 1 doesn't make any sense if you don't have any Greek philosophy. What does it mean in the beginning was the Logos?
Well, it certainly is baffling. It uses, obviously, philosophical concepts that were developed in the Platonic Academy, amongst the ancient Stoics, and amongst even the Middle Platonists, in order to expound the interpretation of Hebrew and Christian scripture. Regarding the gods, Origen is not an atheist about the gods of the Greeks. And this is, I think, important to remember. A lot of times, the sort of new atheists will say that Christians are atheists about all the gods. To the contrary, Origen, amongst the church fathers, believes that there are demonic powers in the world, and that there is a communication and influence and even magical happenings that occur as a response to and incantation of these divine powers, these holy powers in the world. However, and this is the important point, he, like Justin Martyr and like Irenaeus, will make a distinction between the holy powers that serve and those that oppose the coming of Christian revelation. So in a certain sense, he acknowledges all of the Greek gods. However, he doesn't believe that we have our primary responsibility to them alone. He thinks that the gods of the Greeks, as it were, are the messengers that serve either to communicate or to oppose the coming of Christian revelation and the announcement of the divinity of Christ.
So he thinks that there are some of these messengers, which are the Greek gods, that do not oppose but favor Christianity. Is that right?
Yes, so the distinction that later Christian authors will make between angels and demons is a distinction that is made by Origen and Irenaeus to distinguish between the the angels that, on the one hand, communicate as messengers of the announcement of the coming of Christ, and the demons or the holy powers that refuse that messaging, that as it were obstinately oppose Christian revelation. And so in a certain sense, in this sense, he acknowledges the reality of the gods of the Greeks as well as the other non-Christian peoples, while at the same time not according them the same moral standing as he attributes to the angels that communicate and obey and respond gratefully towards Christian revelation.
Antonio, how does this compare to the sort of Proclus or Platinian conception of angelology?
Well, I mean, they use this term, right? Proclus. I'm not quite so sure how often Plotinus talks about angeloi, but yeah, he talks about angeloi, and they're kind of a kind of daimons, right? So they're separately existing souls that have that are always connected to some kind of intelligence. And they do have this messenger function. They illuminate. But they don't have this idea. There is no distinction here between, say, evil and good messengers. What there are evil daimonists. These are daimonists that are responsible for drawing people to matter. Although they're not in themselves evil, they are just doing their function. The world of generation needs for there to be evil people and people attached to matter, because that's how we get animals, right? People are reborn, souls are reborn as animals as a form of punishment. So if there were no vicious people, there would be no non-human animals, and the world would be less perfect. So there needs to be these daimonists whose function is to draw people down. But there is no use of this to then explain texts of other cultures. I mean, there's no explanation in Proclus of Christianity. I mean, you can say that this is a global explanation, right? Proclus in general doesn't mention Christianity. There are just some ways that he has to allude to it. He seems to relate to it as a fad, right? It's what most people nowadays think. It's not the truth. It'll pass. And so you can, but I mean, within this theodicy, you can say, well, it's just the latest way that the gods are making sure that most people are vicious so that we have enough animals. But there's not this use of the use of this theory of spirits to explain Christian or even Jewish traditions. So what there is, I mean, right, what Porphyry and Julian the Apostate, Celsus do, they do think that the Jewish tradition is divine. They think there's this Jewish national God. Some will then be dismissive of it, say that it's just a daimon, it's not properly a god, although that's not clear. Sometimes he'll be syncretized with or identified with Zeus, or the god of all things, and so but there's not something like this angels and demons instrument.
Well, I appreciate you both very much, and I hope, Antonio, this was not too discomforting to you.